Right now, you're listening to the Azeem Digital Asks Podcast, the podcast where I, Azeem, talk to some of the top marketers in the industry, find out everything about them, how they got to where they are today, and more importantly, sharing some really useful marketing tips that will help everybody listening to this become better marketers. Stay tuned for another great episode. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Azeem Digital Asks Podcast. Oh my God, really excited for my guest today. So I'm going to steal her Twitter bio and then add a bit at the end. So you know who she is anyway. She's a keynote speaker, dabbles in data science and ML, serial entrepreneur, which I will pick her brains about. Previously the senior SEO scientist at Moz, but on the side to that, she does awesome MozCon intros. If I could ever get an introduction to a conference the way that she introduces people, bucket list ticked. The awesome Britney Muller. Britney, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Azeem.
You are more than welcome. So I ask every guest like a little icebreaker, but for somebody like yourself who's well known, well respected in the industry, I don't want to know about like the last food you ate or the last film you saw. The icebreaker that I want you to share, and totally put you on the spot because you've not prepared for this, but I would like you to share with the listeners one random fact about yourself that you're happy to share, but you haven't shared on any other podcast or interview before.
Ooh. Is this like a fun fact?
It could be anything. I've got you thinking now.
So many weird things. I've always been like an overthinker. And this is sort of a funny anecdote, is that when I was in first grade, I was reading at a fairly advanced level. Like probably shouldn't have been reading some of the things that I would come across. And long story short, I read this Time magazine article about heart attacks, and I convinced myself for several months that I was actively having a heart attack at all times as a student. I was like this neurotic, like overthinker for a long time, and that's just like a funny example of, early on.
I've got so many follow-up questions.
So funny. Not many people know that story, but I think it's absolutely hilarious.
That could just open up a whole other episode, so I'll probably have to talk to you again about how you can be a youngster convinced that you're having a heart attack. But yeah, look, we'll dive into the sort of meat and bones of this podcast. Really excited to have you on. Before we kick off, for anybody who their loss does not know who you are, what you do, would you like to give a better introduction to yourself?
I thought you did a beautiful job. I really appreciate the intro you gave me. The only other thing I might add is that I am a data science student. I am a student of machine learning and all of these things that I'm so passionate about. It's an active process of learning and breaking things and then sharing it with all of you wonderful people that then can use these tools and tricks that I've learned and take things to the next level.
Awesome. So I'm really glad to have you on, and we're going to be talking about data science, ML, things that people really respect you for in this industry, and you are one of the first names that pops up when people are looking to learn more about this. So I wanted to start from the very beginning. Several different definitions, but how would you define what sort of data science and ML are?
Yeah, so data science is quite broad. It's a field in and of itself that uses algorithms and different systems to extract knowledge. So, for example, business intelligence often falls within the world of data science. And then, on top of that, you have machine learning, which is a part of artificial intelligence. And it's a very specific part that deals with training models to learn different things over a series of training kind of iterations.
Awesome. So what does it mean to be a data scientist? And as you mentioned earlier, you're a student as well. So what does it mean to be a student at the same time?
Yeah, it really means brushing up on 101, something that I didn't realize was going to be such an important part of this journey for me is statistics, and kind of going back to the basics and having a really strong understanding of, okay, how can I statistically view a corpus of data? How do I better understand the data to not only clean it for potential machine learning programs, but to also describe it, to be able to explain it to a client or a peer?
Okay. Following on from that then, how would you say that looking into this field, let's say, how does it prevent the misinterpretation of data in your opinion?
Ooh, I think that's always very tricky. I think misinterpretation can mean a lot of different things. And I think, at the basis of it, you want to be creating these systems and creating models that are not only efficient and work really well, but are safe and aren't going to potentially, you know, isolate a group of individuals or only work for a certain, you know, sector of data. You have to make sure that it works with all sorts of new data insights.
Awesome. And then this is one question I'm really interested to hear from you on. Are you able to share some of the mistakes that you've made on your journey throughout this field, some that you'd be happy to share with the listeners?
Oh my gosh, I made so many mistakes. I don't even know where to start. I make mistakes every day. And that's kind of part of the process that you really have to lean into, because you can't approach many models, and I would argue even, anything, without having this willingness to run into roadblocks and to fail and to, you know, break a notebook or it no longer works. And so you have to restart a kernel. And I mean, I'm stumbling through those things every single day. Um, yeah, a silly, like more tangible example of that was I was uh, I was trying to train this facial recognition model, and I was doing this at my parents' house, and they have a log house. And while I was trying to train it on like me and my brother and my parents, and it was not working very well. And even when no one was in the frame, it would say that so and so was there, and I realized that the knots in the wood, it was identifying it as eyes. And so that's kind of a funny example of something I never went into it worrying about the background. And now that I've made that mistake, I go into, the visual models with a little bit more experience, in terms of you have to be really careful about everything that you're, putting into these models, including the background and including all these different things.
That is really interesting. Thank you very much for sharing. So I'm going to sidestep a minute, and you've made me think of this. So there's so many things that you have to take into consideration when you're looking at things exactly as you've just mentioned. How do you make sure that you stay on track? So if your goal was to train that model, but then you found out X, Y, and Z can affect it, how do you make sure that you stay on track and try and achieve the goal that you set out without trying to spin several different plates at once, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really great question. And I think there's two parts to the answer. One is that you're constantly testing the model on new data and tweaking it. So as you're building the model, you need to be flexible with new data, be open to training it at different iterations and different steps. These are like two of kind of the knobs that you turn in machine learning, and adjusting those to get the best outcomes is really important. But beyond that, there's this new field sort of surfacing. It's called ML ops, which is the whole process all the way through. And it's not something that's talked about all that much, but it's incredibly important, because after you create a good model, you can't just leave it. There's data drift. There's all sorts of things that can start to occur with a model that needs to be observed. And so there's these different platforms that have come forward that practice really incredible observability practices and interpretability. So they allow you to see what's happening within these models, to tweak it even after you've implemented a model into a system. That I foresee becoming more and more important as we go forward in the future.
Yeah, That's interesting, and it leads me very nicely onto my next question, and it's about ethics and what you think the ethical implications are of doing things like this and training models like this. I'd be keen to know what you think.
It's very scary because we have this sort of dreamy, lofty goals of creating these models that are ethical and fair, but we're feeding it text and language from 100 years ago that hasn't moved forward with the times, isn't as progressive, has lots of bias and all sorts of stuff baked into it. So I think we have to be a lot more careful about what we're feeding the data and not just continue to think, oh, larger data sets is the answer. Because quite frankly, we've seen that, time and time again, that it's not. I mean, you even use Google Translate today, and there's different languages. When you put in scientists, it translates it to the he pronoun. There's all sorts of instances of even different observability with, it's called this T-SNE visualization. So it basically shows you nodes that are most closely related to another node or a word. And if you look at what BERT was built on top of, and you just put in the word engineer, the closest nodes are Sir, Michael, Jonathan. Like, it's very apparent how, kind of slanted these models are. So I think the whole practice of ethical AI, there needs to be standards that are put into place, and there needs to be stricter guidelines as far as how these things are built moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you about misconceptions then. So as somebody who I and many in the industry would consider very experienced in this area, what are some of the common misconceptions about doing some of the work that you do?
Yeah, so I get this a lot where I will be approached with a problem, right? And it'll just be, how can we use machine learning to identify all of the product pages on this website where the URL structure is all wonky? And there's different instances like that example that I come across more and more, that, to be honest, this doesn't need machine learning. There's really great heuristic models that can be put into place that are far easier, far less computationally expensive, and faster. So I think, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And in this case, as the years have kind of gone on, I have figured out that, oh crap, like, not machine learning can't solve everything, and it shouldn't. And so there's still a lot of great room and space for automation, just using heuristic type models, like a tree-based model. Is the add to cart button available on this page? If so, add it to this list, right? That was the solution for that question. But yeah, I would think that's the most misconception, is that people that don't have a strong understanding of what machine learning is really good at struggle to identify appropriate problems for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And your answer has led me very nicely to this question that I'm about to ask you. So typically, certainly in my experience, the C-suite are those people who will come to data scientists and say, solve this problem that probably can't be solved by a data scientist. So hypothetical situation, you're in the room with a member of the C-suite and you need to try and sort of sell or tell them the benefits of data science. How do you do that in a language that they understand?
I would directly tie it to their bottom line business metrics or business goals. I have found that in order to communicate the value as clearly as possible, it has to be tied back to what the C-suite cares about. So if that's revenue, how do we directly tie that into dollars? How do you do that? But yeah, what you just mentioned, it happens all the time in the field of data science, and is kind of complained about quite a bit, where these individuals have gone to school to be a data scientist, and they go to their first job interview, and the interviewer gives them a huge boatload of data and says, tell me something of this. And the data scientist goes, well, what do you want to know? I'm like, well, just tell me an insight. And so it's kind of this back and forth thing where it's expensive to figure out the right questions. right? That's a super expensive thing. Dumping a bunch of data is relatively now inexpensive due to the amount of data that we have access to. So this is where it comes back to statistics and the fundamentals. If you're able to properly evaluate a data set with that statistical point of reference, you're able to provide a lot more value and a lot more guidance to C-suite moving forward about what's possible, what you could potentially do, what could be cleaned out, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for sharing. And then the last question, sort of C-suite related. And I've asked this question to a guest before, but I think I'm really interested to hear your answer because you're obviously very data driven. Not that my previous guest wasn't, but have you ever been in a situation where a conclusion has already been drawn and people have come to you and said, can you bend or twist the data to prove this theory that I've already arrived at without any data? And if you haven't, what would you say if somebody came to you and presented you with that situation?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one. I can't recall directly experiencing that. I have heard horror stories of that, and there's a couple data scientists that I follow who, when they're approached with that, and even in general, they practice trying to do both sides of it. So they practice trying to use the data to fulfill this kind of goal and to answer these, questions and strategy versus this. And I find that absolutely fascinating. I think keeping an open mind and really letting the data sort of speak for itself says volumes.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So I have personally been in that situation before and I've just flat out refused. I've said if you've already arrived at a conclusion, then you can ride off into the sunset on that. But I am not telling lies or bending the truth
Yeah.
to make somebody else happy. But yeah, moving swiftly on, what would you see as the future for this area? So I don't want to be sort of stereotypical and say where do you see it in 5 years' time, but knowing what you know and learning what you've learned so far, and I imagine what you'll continue to learn throughout, where do you see the future of this field?
Yeah, this will continue to become more and more accessible. And I envision it being accessible to just about anyone, where you can sort of drag and drop models in different data sets in essentially an OS system built for machine learning. Um, every single month, there's these incredible releases of libraries and code that more efficiently do these things in a shorter, packet, in a shorter line of code. And so as this continues to evolve, it will be built into more accessible frameworks for the everyday marketer, the everyday professional to tap into.
Awesome. So let's talk about beginning to learn in this field. So if somebody wanted to start learning more, fresh, where would they begin?
There's a couple different places I would point people to. One being code labs. And so a lot of people don't feel they're ready to jump into something like code labs, but I would argue differently because in my experience, when I'm able to just try things and build things step by step, it gives me confidence to know that I could potentially do that again with different data. And that's exactly what I do. I basically go out, I Google, I go on GitHub, I find models that already do something really, really well. And I consider what else can I make that do? How can I inject my client's data or different sorts of information and make it do something else? So CodeLab is a really, really great place for that. Kaggle is the #1 data science competition website, and they've got really great kind of getting started tutorials. The hello world of machine learning is MNIST. It's where you build a model to recognize handwritten images. That one's really fun. That was the first one I ever did back in, oh my gosh, 2013 to 2014. And then, now it's also quite popular to try to do things like the Titanic model, where you train on passenger data. And what I have found to be most fascinating, and Azeem, this is something I think about all the time, is that, as I'm coming at these problems from a data science perspective, and even I would argue SEOs and the data we have access to, it's very, very easy to overlook the fact that these numbers are actual individuals. And let me tell you, nothing wakes you up from that like playing with real data like the Titanic passenger data. So I was cleaning that data set a couple months ago and wanted to submit, an algorithm model just for fun. And the first thing you do when you get a data set and you're trying to work through these programs is you clean the data. So you're looking for inconsistencies or nulls or duplicates. And for some reason, in my notebook, I looked at, are there any duplicate ticket numbers? Because the way that the Titanic tickets were distributed, every individual had their own ticket number. And then within the data set, it said where they purchased it, yada, yada, the room, all the stuff. And I came across 6 individuals that had the same ticket number. And I almost just dropped it and moved on. But I was like, wait a second, this is interesting. Why would 6 people have the same ticket number? Actually, it was 7 people. And it really bothered me. I was like, wait a minute. So I looked into it. I pulled up all of that data, and they all share the same last name. Now, this conclusion might be incorrect, but I can't stop thinking about and this was one of the lowest class cabins. What if this family couldn't afford tickets for every person in their family? And somehow they got copies of one ticket. This is what appears to have happened. And it just broke my heart because you also see like who lived and who died, and, getting this shock of like this whole family, got on this ship through, semi-nefarious ways, but to get them to America and probably to have a better life. And they all passed, like things like that, looking at COVID data, like this stuff wakes you up really fast. And I think it's important to have that when you're looking at things from a website perspective, right? And visitors and number of unique users. It's so important to not forget, like these are real people.
Yeah, that's a really incredible story. Thank you very much for sharing that. I've sidetracked thinking about this family now and the journey that they made. It's it definitely does wake you up for sure. You should definitely write a blog post or something. 100%. That is something that I would love to learn more about. So yeah, look, thanks again. I wanted to continue the theme of learning then. So if you were talking to a young individual who is really interested in a career in this field, typically in other disciplines of marketing, there are 2 choices. You either study, go to university, college, whichever, graduate, or you just jump in head first and get that real world experience. In this particular field, certainly as an outsider looking in, it's huge and the possibilities are massive. Which route would you advise them to take?
That's really tricky because I am self-taught. I am a student of the open source network, and I am extremely, extremely grateful for the online access that I have to all this information. Having not been to school, I can't really, I haven't been to school for data science. I can't speak on that. I've heard really great things. And I think it really depends on the person. But it's funny, thinking about the learning process, I would give the exact same advice to someone starting out in SEO. And that is to build their own little website, build their own data set and play with it, tinker with it, get it working to do, kind of silly things. And this helps build your confidence. And beyond that, I mean, how grateful, how lucky are we all to have access to MIT's online coursework for data science? Harvard, start with their CS 109 class on GitHub. That was the first class I ever took. And I got addicted after Harvard CS 109. So I think, to start just to dabble a bit in these different online opportunities with the courses and with just what's currently available and see what feels right for you. Some people need a classroom. Some people need a curriculum to learn. I found that's not necessarily how I learn, and I like going down rabbit holes, and I like getting stuck and figuring stuff out, and kind of changing my schedule accordingly. So I think it's just really depends on what it is that you want to happen at the end as well. Like, what is your end goal, and to experiment from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And then thinking about studying and specifically about big data, I think over here, the whole concept of big data and degrees, it seems to have just been like slept on, and it's only just really started to blow up. Lots of different universities are now putting out degrees, 3-4 year courses about big data. And for me, I suppose I'm biased because I'm a marketer and I live and breathe data, probably nowhere near as much as you, side note, but I can't fathom why that is. Why has this been like slept on for so long? And is that the case over in the States as well, or has it always been such a thing?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think at this point, it's sort of a bit of analysis paralysis. There is so much data readily available. People don't know what to do with it. And I think that's the biggest opportunity for marketers too, is really leveraging this field to better understand data. I agree that it has sort of been like a missed opportunity as far as education goes. That's why some of the online resources and Andrew Ng's courses have been really popular, because it's up to sort of the cutting edge work that people are doing currently. And I sometimes worry that different higher ed institutions have a hard time keeping up with the industry. I mean, that in and of itself, it's a full-time job. I wouldn't expect a higher ed professor to necessarily do that. But with this field moving as rapidly as it is, I do think there could be some advantage to really experimenting with online courses, tutorials. And you know what? This always surprises people. YouTube is my best friend. I know that sounds weird because a lot of this is very technical and long, but for whatever reason, I do best by watching someone do it. Like, even if that's programming, I really enjoy watching people go through it and struggle and figure it out, and then doing it with them has been really, really fun. And it's helped solve so many problems that I couldn't find on Stack Overflow or just searching Google. So you'd be surprised what things like YouTube can offer as well.
Yeah, co-sign to that. I definitely learn best by seeing and doing just information sheet, step 1, step 2, step 3, just disengage with it. But yeah, look, sadly we are coming towards the end of this episode, but this has been brilliant as expected. The last couple of questions I have for you, if you could narrow it down to a handful of things, I'll say up to 3, but feel free to add in as many as you want. What things would you want people to take away from this episode with you?
One is that, if you are interested in data science, better understanding large data sets, these techniques, this knowledge is available to you. And this is part of my larger mission of, I've been working really hard on materials for datasci101.com, where I'm trying to make these things way, way, way more accessible. Of course, there's different tutorials and things available, and some of which I mention and I encourage, but I think we could even take that a step further, because a lot of the documentation, once you get to a certain level, it's incredibly hard to understand. Like, just even the pandas data set for data cleaning is really, really hard to understand. And so those are some of the things that I'm working really hard to make it easier, so that, those of you listening and those people interested, they don't have to waste the same amount of time that I have. I really do want to share different kind of hacks and cheat sheets so that you can get up to speed a lot faster. And I think that's within everyone's reach. And I think what's really unique is that everyone has specific domain expertise. I don't care if you're a caretaker for someone or what your job is, you have domain expertise in your day-to-day life, and that can be applied to really brilliant machine learning models and solutions that can help serve a greater good. I think that's super exciting as well. Don't be afraid to break things. I think that's a huge, something I really try to encourage people to do. And yeah, none of us know what we're doing, so just give it a try. No one knows what they're actually doing, It's just like on a floating rock. So go crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really refreshing to hear somebody with your experience and knowledge to say things like that, because I think it really warm people who are listening to this. But yeah, absolutely brilliant. Thank you for being a brilliant guest. If people, well, they should be already, by the way, but if people wanted to find you on social media, follow you, get in touch, how can they do that?
Yep, I'm just Britney Muller. That's my handle for Twitter and Instagram and several other platforms. And it's just BritneyMuller.
Awesome. And then this is the part of the podcast where I essentially shut up and let my guests have the final say on the episode. So within reason, don't say anything that could, get us both into hot water. But the final word on this episode is all yours. Thank you for being a great guest.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. This has been a real treat and so fun to do with you. Let's see. I think people just need to be more kind. I see more stuff online and even in the SEO community where people are either quick to judge or quick to call something out that's some company or proprietary has done wrong. And I think everyone needs to practice a little bit more kindness these days. So I think I would just leave it with that.
So that was another great episode in the bag. I'm really enjoying hearing from some brilliant people in this industry. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow me on Spotify. Please leave a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you are using. Tell a friend to tell a friend, and hopefully see you for the next episode.